915 Lima, Fort Dodge Radio, go ahead.
I have no idea where I'm going. I'm going to crash. Mayday, mayday, mayday.
9815 Lima, say last known position.
I have no idea. Mayday, mayday, mayday. I'm going to crash.
9815 Lima, say altitude.
Rolling. I'm rolling. Oh, my God. Ah. Help! Help!
Calling Fort Dodge, release the stick, go forward on the stick, and then slowly back again.
I'm level. I'm straight level. I don't know where I am.
The previous audio recording was an actual Mayday radio call received by the Fort Dodge Flight Service Station. The single pilot claimed later that he had unintentionally entered a spin in instrument meteorological conditions. As hundreds of pilots across the country approach a fixed-base operator this year to rent a general aviation aircraft, few think about the potential and the danger of an upset attitude called a spin. In fact, most private and many commercial pilots have never conducted spin training in an aircraft. Spin awareness is often tested during pilot certification. However, the testing is usually limited to the oral portion of the check ride, as it is an emphasis area within most practical test standards. Furthermore, the Federal Aviation Regulations only require spin training for initial flight instructor applicants. What does all this mean? Well, it probably means that there are hundreds or even thousands of pilots out in the general aviation public that have never conducted spins in an approved aircraft for the purpose of developing their spin recognition and recovery techniques to become a safe, more competent pilot. Hi, my name is Ryan Carlson. I'm a certified flight instructor at the University of North Dakota's aerospace program. I teach aerobatics and CFI spin certification training in our Super Decathlon, in addition to conducting check rides for various certificates and ratings. While conducting private and commercial pilot practical exams, I consistently ask the question, what is a spin? It requires a simple rote answer, but in actuality, the complexities of a spin reach far beyond the coined response and uncoordinated stall. Let's take a closer look at some information and facts to formulate our own insights in regards to spin recognition and recovery to ensure that we become a safe, more competent pilot. Regarding my previous question, what is a spin, with the statement an uncoordinated stall, is in fact a correct answer. According to the Federal Aviation Administration's Airplane Flying Handbook, a spin is defined as an aggravated stall that results in what is termed autorotation, wherein the airplane follows a downward corkscrew path. Let's disseminate the previous statement to understand the definition more clearly. First of all, a stall is a condition of the wing that results from exceeding the critical angle of attack. The critical angle of attack is the specific angle that once exceeded causes substantial separation of airflow. During this stalled condition, there is a significant increase in drag and decrease in lift. The FAA's published definition mentioned an aggravated stall. What defines and causes this type of stall? Well, during an aggravated or uncoordinated stall, we can assume that one wing experiences a higher angle of attack than the other. This may occur if the pilot does not prevent a slipping or skidding tendency. From your first experiences as a student pilot, your flight instructor has undoubtedly mentioned keep the ball centered. They are referring to the inclinometer. This simple little instrument actually plays an important role in spin prevention. If you keep the ball centered during a stall and associated recovery, you will maintain coordination and prevent that aggravated stalled situation. If your aircraft does become uncoordinated during a stall, meaning the relative wind is not aligned with the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, one wing will have less lift and more drag than the other. In other words, our aircraft would have asymmetrical lift and drag when comparing one wing to the other. This situation would cause a yawing, rolling, and pitching tendency. We would roll about the longitudinal axis towards the wing with less lift, we would yaw about the vertical axis towards the wing with more drag, and we would pitch down as a result of a decreased vertical component of lift. The FAA's published definition mentions the term autorotation. Autorotation is normally a term synonymous with helicopters during an engine failure. However, during the fully developed phase of a spin, autorotation does occur. The aircraft automatically rotates about an axis that is nearly vertical, called the spin axis, due to external forces being coupled, where the rotation experiences equilibrium. The reason that the aircraft has a downward corkscrew path during the fully developed phase of a spin is because of gravity. Gravity is a force that normally opposes the vertical component of lift. During a spin, vertical lift has decreased due to the stall condition of the wing and the attitude of the aircraft. Consequently, the force of gravity pulls the aircraft towards the ground, and the decreased amount of vertical lift is unable to oppose the gravitational force. Now that we have defined and elaborated on a spin, let's discuss the different phases of flight that they are most likely to inadvertently occur. Of course, a spin could unintentionally occur during any phase of flight because an aircraft can stall and be uncoordinated at any attitude and airspeed. But spins are more common during critical phases of flight, including takeoffs, the traffic pattern, a go-around, and landings. During these phases of flight, the aircraft is at a slower airspeed, meaning the angle of attack will be closer to the critical angle of attack. Also, the aircraft may be maneuvering, meaning that if proper rudder application isn't applied with different power settings and bank angles, uncoordinated flight may occur. When maneuvering with a bank angle, indicated stall speed will increase with an increase in load factor. Remember, it is important to be vigilant in regards to spin prevention during all phases of flight, with an emphasis placed on the critical phases. I have mentioned a few new terms during the previous portion of the lesson. Let's expand on their pertinent definitions. I had briefly discussed the fully developed phase of a spin. There are actually 4 phases during a spin. The first phase is the entry phase. This begins when the necessary inputs are applied to cause an aggravated stall. The aircraft exceeds the critical angle of attack during uncoordinated flight. The incipient phase is the second phase during a spin and begins as the rotation starts. The yawing, rolling, and pitching moments that we discussed earlier are changing throughout the incipient phase. Most sources of spin information agree that the incipient phase lasts between 1 to 2 rotations. However, several factors can affect the duration of this phase. Aircraft weight, center of gravity, configuration, and power settings can affect both the attitude and the radius of the incipient phase. The inherent characteristics of an aircraft will cause some variations dependent upon the type aircraft. The airspeed at which you begin the spin can have a significant impact. When the aircraft enters a spin at a higher airspeed, it has more inertia. The incipient phase will last longer in terms of rotation, one rotation being a change of heading equaling 360 degrees. However, because drag has significantly increased due to the stall condition of the wing and the deflected control surfaces, in other words rudder, elevator, possibly aileron, the airspeed will continue to decrease until it approaches close to the published indicated stall speed, where it will remain throughout the next phase. The fully developed phase is the third phase of a spin. During this phase, the aircraft is rotating about the spin axis in a downward corkscrew path. Once within the fully developed phase, the aircraft has reached equilibrium or out of rotation. According to the Airplane Flying Handbook, the airspeed, vertical speed, and angular rotation rate are constant. For example, we can assume that the third rotation of the fully developed phase is exactly the same as the 13th rotation, which is exactly the same as the 23rd rotation, and so on. I mentioned earlier that the aircraft has reached equilibrium. The external forces acting upon the aircraft have become constant. These forces would include inertia and aerodynamic forces. In order to stop this phase from continuing, the pilot must apply specific control inputs to regain normal, controlled flight. Since we mentioned the spin axis during our discussion of the fully developed phase, let's elaborate on that term. The spin axis is a fourth axis that is created once the rotation of a spin begins, which the aircraft is rotating about. During our primary flight training, we learned about 3 axes: the lateral axis, the longitudinal axis, and the vertical axis. Each of these axes intersects through the center of gravity of our aircraft. The spin axis does not necessarily pass through the center of gravity. In fact, as the aircraft transitions from the incipient to the fully developed phase, the spin axis location is changing in relation to the aircraft. Other factors can affect this axis too, including weight, center of gravity location, configuration, power settings, and inherent aircraft characteristics. You can assume that the axis is located on the inside of the rotation and is nearly vertical during the fully developed phase. Let's move on to the final phase of a spin. The fourth phase of a spin is a recovery. During this phase, the pilot has initiated a series of control inputs that are often specific to each make and model of aircraft flown to stop the spin and regain normal flight. Prior to operating an aircraft, the pilot should refer to the approved airplane flight manual or pilot's operating handbook to determine the approved recovery procedure. Many aircraft are not approved for intentional spins, which would be placarded in the aircraft and found in the limitations section of the POH. Although there are many variations to each aircraft's recovery technique, the same objective exists between all of them. The pilot needs to stop the rotation, regain coordinated flight, and decrease the angle of attack so that the wing is no longer stalled. In the Piper Warrior 3's POH, the manufacturer's approved published recovery procedure is rudder control wheel throttle, rudder control wheel. First, you must stop the rotation of the spin through opposite rudder application. This step will coordinate the aircraft. Next, you must reduce the angle of attack by applying full forward pressure on the control wheel and keeping the ailerons neutral. This step should decrease the aircraft's angle of attack to less than the critical angle of attack. The ailerons should not be used during the initial portion of the recovery due to the possibility of aggravating the stall by producing asymmetrical lift and drag on the wings. You must reduce the throttle to idle. This will prevent a nose-up tendency from the power application. It will also slow your rate of descent in terms of feet per minute. Finally, rudder and the control wheel can be used accordingly after the pilot has effectively recovered from the spin. Some slight variations can be found in other aircraft. For instance, in the Cessna 172, the manufacturer's published recommended recovery procedure is power, aileron, rudder, elevator. Similar to the recovery procedure of the Piper Warrior, power should be reduced to idle, aileron should be neutral, rudder should be applied to the opposite direction of the rotation, and once the rotation stops, the elevator should be forward as required to break the stall. Let's take a look at our aircraft's recovery technique. In the American Champion Decathlon, the manufacturer's approved published recovery technique is to recover with positive movement of the control stick to the neutral position and opposite rudder until the rotation stops. Then rudder should be neutral, followed by a smooth recovery from the dive to level flight. These are three slightly different recovery techniques based upon spin testing during certification for that particular aircraft. The spin would seem like an upset attitude that would be easy to avoid. Keep the aircraft coordinated and prevent from stalling, right? Well, if the proper precautions are taken, you are absolutely right. I once heard that two different pilots can encounter the same abnormal situation and can achieve two different outcomes based upon knowledge, experience, and judgment. The same principles can be applied to spin awareness. Remember, an inadvertent spin is insidious in nature. It can occur in any phase of flight in any airplane. To prevent an inadvertent spin, you must possess thorough knowledge about spin awareness, practice spin prevention techniques, and have the ability to exercise sound judgment during all phases of flight. From all of us at UND Aerospace, enjoy the rest of your flight training. Remember, spin prevention relies upon you, the pilot in command. Have fun and fly safe.